The church is not a building. We sang that this morning. And it's true. We all know that it's true on some level, though I know we sometimes forget it and become obsessed with our buildings. But it's true. The church is not a building. And I know it goes on to say, well, the church is a people, and of course it is true that the church is made up of people. But I need to say that the church is more than just a group of people. It's bigger than that. The Apostle Paul, in his writings, liked to compare the church to a body. Said the church is a body, and we often think of that in terms of a human body. And we think of the various people in the church as parts of that body, hands, feet, legs, and so on. True enough. But let me suggest another way to think about that today. Think of the church as a body, but think of it on the cellular level. Think of the church made up of thousands, if not millions, of individual living cells. Now, of course, every living cell in that body is indeed an individual. Everyone is absolutely unique and has a life of its own. But the wonderful thing about that, of course, is that when you put them all together, and when those cells depend on one another, you have a whole that is greater than just the sum of all those little parts. The other amazing thing, when you think about a body on that cellular level, is this. The cells in our bodies have a limited lifespan. Did you know, for example, that every skin cell in your body lives only about 2 or 3 weeks? Then it dies, is sloughed off, and replaced with another. That means, therefore, that if you have not been to church for 3 weeks, every single person you meet and see today has a different face than the last time you saw them. And if that doesn't blow your mind, I don't know what will. On top of that, they say that every living cell in your body dies and is replaced within 7 years. Every single cell. With the notable exception of your brain cells, they are designed to last your whole life long. When they die, they are not replaced. But everything else dies and is replaced within 7 years. So that means that if you met me 7 years ago, and then met me again today, the person who would be facing you would be like 90% a completely different person. And that's God will blow your mind. But the thing is this, we don't live that way, do we? We don't think that way. And in fact, if you were to meet me 7 years ago, and say we were talking together and we were carrying on a conversation, and then we were separated for 7 years, and you saw me again today, we would simply pick up right where we left off, wouldn't we? We would carry on with that conversation. The handshake we would share would be the same handshake, even if the hands doing the shaking are completely renewed. That is because we recognize that even though the various parts of our body are sloughing off and being replaced, that there is a whole that is greater than the parts. There is a continuity. Well, it is the same thing with the Christian church. You know what? If you were to come to this place 100 years ago and worship together with the congregation of St. Andrew's Hesper, not a single person who is here today would be there back then. Not a single one. Everyone would have died and been replaced. So on one level you might say it would be a completely different congregation, right? But it's not. Not really. Because there is a continuity. There is a sense in which the whole of a congregation is greater than the sum of the parts. And if each individual dies and is replaced, there is a continual living organism called the congregation that has continuity. And that's why I think it's very important for us as a congregation to understand who we are in terms of our history and how we got here. Our history matters a great deal. I mean, we know that as individual human beings. If, say for example, a human being suffers some trauma early in life, we now know that the effects of that trauma will stay with that person for the rest of their lives. And chances are that the effects of that trauma will continue to affect that person, often determining behavior, sometimes inspiring dysfunctional behavior. Well, it's the same way with the church. If a church suffers through some trauma early in its life, the trauma will be lived out in succeeding generations in various things that that church does and how it sometimes behaves dysfunctionally. Of course, if the negative side is true, the positive side is also true. If good things happen to a church, if they experience God in some powerful way, that will continue to affect that church positively through the generations. So if, for example, in its early life, the church finds a deep mission focus, well, that focus will remain with it, continue to influence it for good through succeeding generations. So that's why, during this month of October, I want to try and understand who we are as a congregation based on where we've been, based on our past history, in an effort to understand who we are and why we sometimes behave as we do today. And of course, we need to start right at the beginning. We need to start today by looking at what it was like to be a Presbyterian way back when this community was little more than a farming village and was known as New Hope. What did it mean to be a Presbyterian way back then? Well, according to the annals of our church history, our congregational history, it all began sometime around 1800 when a group of Presbyterians living in New Hope decided to go down and participate in the life of Knox's Presbyterian Church down in Galt. And according to the story, the way from here to there back then was not easy. There were no good roads, and so the people had to walk. And yes, the story goes that they would actually take off their good Sunday shoes, not wanting to soil them. They would carry them all the way down to Galt. They would then wash their feet in the mill stream, put the shoes back on, and go to church. It is quite a story, isn't it? I gotta admit, it kind of reminds me of the stories my dad used to tell. You know the one about how we used to have to go to school. You used to have to walk 2 miles uphill both ways, barefoot in the snow. I can't help but wonder whether maybe the story did grow a little bit in the telling over the years. But even if it was a little bit exaggerated as it was told and retold, there's definitely a grain of truth there. And the reality was, for those people back at the beginning, to go and participate in the life of the church was not easy, and it took a great deal of commitment and dedication. And I got to ask the question, well, why did they do it? Why were they willing to put up with the suffering and the pain and the stubbed toes just to go and participate in the life of a church down in Galt? Why did they put up with all of the frustration and the problems and the difficulties of eventually founding a church here in New Hope? By then I think it was called Hesper. And actually building that building that still stands at the top of the hill over there. Why did they put up with all of that? Because you know what? We live in a day and an age where just about any excuse will do not to go to church. I couldn't get a parking spot close by. It was raining. I forgot to bring my umbrella. I was out late last night. These are all excuses that we use that are considered to be perfectly valid in many cases. And I'm afraid that they pale in comparison to a 9-kilometer trek from New Hope to Galt through the wilds of the Grand River Valley. Why did they do it? Why did they put up with it? We can guess some of the reasons, of course. It probably had something to do with a desire to be together with people who were like-minded in their approach to the Christian faith, to be with people who were from the same church that they had been born into. There was probably also a certain desire to meet with people from their own ethnic background, because of course back then Presbyterians almost all came from the same place, all came from Scotland. I don't doubt too that there was a certain lure of the big city of Galt, for people who lived in a little farming village called New Hope. These all might have fed into it, but there has to have been a deeper reason than that. If they put up with all of that, if they put that much effort into it, there must have been more. In fact, it must have been that somehow they encountered God by doing so. Somehow, there was something in what they experienced in the life of the church that lifted them up out of their ordinary, everyday experience and brought them face to face with God. That was worth it all. But what was it? When a church was finally founded here in 1855, we began to have records of what the church was doing, what really mattered to the church. And if you go back to that time and you look through the records of the church, you will find what they really concentrated on. And actually, way back then, most of the entries in the history of the church have to do with discipline. Because you see, back then, the session of a congregation had an enormous amount of authority and power over the members of the church. And so the session of the congregation would regularly judge the people of the church to decide who was in and who was out, who was acceptable and who was not. And the session of the church would regularly expel people from the communion of the church, would not permit them to approach the communion table and participate in the life of the church. And they could do this for many reasons. Some of them we would consider good reasons, some of them we would consider pretty frivolous reasons. And so people would be expelled, for example, for working on Sunday, for drunkenness, for immodest dress, adultery, questioning authority, and the list went on and on and on. This was important to them. In part because they took very seriously that passage we read this morning from Paul's letter to the Corinthians, where Paul says, "Whoever therefore eats the bread and drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be answerable for the body and blood of the Lord." So it is a serious matter to participate in communion, in the life of the church through communion. But they didn't take the next sentence very well. They didn't leave it up to the individuals in the congregation to examine themselves and decide whether they were worthy. The session of the church took it on themselves to judge every member and decide who was in and who was out. We don't do it that way. I mean, I don't think any of us would like to live under that kind of regime where we're constantly being judged based on our conduct or who we are. I also know that the session of this congregation is not at all interested in prying into the individual and personal lives of every person to judge who is correct and who isn't. We don't do that. But for them it was important. For them it was a way of finding God. You need to understand that they were living in very uncertain times. I mean, they were living in times when disease could strike just like that, could strike someone down and they didn't even understand why. They were living in an age where crops could be destroyed and they didn't understand why. When weather could change totally unexpectedly. They were surrounded by uncertainty. They felt as if their world could give up on them at any moment. And so they craved a sense of security. They craved a sense of certainty. And they found that in the clear moral leadership of the session of the church. That doesn't mean they always liked the judgments that were laid down. Doesn't mean they always agreed with them. But they found a comfort in the imposition of those decisions. They found God. They found the certainty and security of God. We don't do that. When I stand behind this table in a few minutes, I will issue an invitation. And I invite you to pay attention to that invitation because it's important. And the invitation that I will give will be wide open. I will say that all are welcome. All those who simply trust in God, all of those who put their trust in Jesus and are in a right relationship with their neighbors are welcome. Everyone. I do that because I believe the session of this congregation believes that this table, this bread and this wine is a gift from God given to all God's people. And that we can approach this table not because of anything we've done or failed to do, not because of who we are or what we've accomplished, not even because we believe the correct things, but that we can approach this table based only on the merits of Jesus Christ and what he has done for us. Nothing else gives us permission to approach. We leave it wide open. They didn't. They, in fact, did what they called fencing the table. They set up barriers. And so they, before communion, the minister would get up and he would explicitly state who could not come to the table. He would list all of the infractions that would mean that you were not welcome. He would probably even name people by name who were not welcome at this table. And the table, by the way, would be back there, not way out here. And communion was such a serious matter to them that they actually only did it once a year. And if you think the service goes long today, and it will go a little bit longer than usual, you know nothing about what it was like for them. Communion was what we would consider a week-long ordeal. It was important. It was important to them that they approached the table in that way because they believed that they there met God. And yes, the God who they met there was definitely a God of judgment. A God of clear right and clear wrong, but you see, they found comfort in that because it gave them security and certainty in a world filled with uncertainty. The God that we meet at this table, my friends, is a God of grace. And in fact, my highest calling, my most important task in my ministry, I would say, is to get through that message that you are welcome at this table, you are welcome before God, acceptable before God, not on the basis of what you've done or who you are or where you come from or what you have kept yourself from doing, but only because of Jesus Christ. Only because of him and what he has done. And knowing that we experience God at this table, and it is a God of grace. And that is what we need most. And yet at the same time, I think it's important to recognize that we are the heirs of people who approach this table very differently. Who approached it with fear and trembling and approached it knowing they would meet their God of judgment. And does who they were affect who we are today? Absolutely it does. Because we're part of the same body. Every cell may have been replaced, but we are part of the same body. And their approach still affects us to this day. It affects us, I think, when things go wrong in the church. And things have always gone wrong in the church. Things always will go wrong in the church. When they do, we have this tendency, though, don't we, to thinking that by doing that, we will find God again, that we will find certainty and security. Doesn't work. Often it pushes us farther away from God, but we try it anyways. Which again is why we need to be reminded that the God we meet at this table is a God of grace. Come near this table. Approach it with joy. Approach it with assurance. Not because of who you are. Not because of what you've done, but because of what Jesus has done for you. When we approach the table in this way, here we do meet the God of Jesus Christ, the God of grace. Will you take a few moments now, again, to examine your life, to prepare yourself to approach this day?